Have you ever laughed at someone for failing, only to realize they could outperform you in ways you never imagined? That's what happened when a quiet woman named Erin showed up at a rural construction yard, struggling to lift a jackhammer on her first day. The crew laughed, until the sleeve of her shirt rolled up and a single black ink tattoo shifted their entire perspective. What started as mockery became stunned silence, and what unfolded next changed every man on that job site. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Erin Thompson had always chosen the hard road, not because she enjoyed difficulty, but because her life had never offered her anything else. On that warm Monday morning in the outskirts of Carson Ridge, Montana, she stepped off the worn-out bus with nothing more than a beat-up duffel bag, a faded baseball cap pulled low, and a letter of temporary assignment folded 3 times in her back pocket. The local construction crew she was joining had no idea what to make of her. She was lean, compact, with shoulders that hinted at athleticism, but not much bulk. Her work boots looked fresh, her jeans weren't scuffed yet, and worst of all for the men watching from the gravel clearing, she was the only woman among them. There was an almost palpable silence that fell as she approached the equipment shed, and it was the kind of quiet laced with skepticism. Her assignment had come through a last-minute recommendation from the county employment office. The crew had been short-staffed, and none of the usual guys were willing to haul tools up and down the craggy hillside trail where the new telecom pole line was being installed. They needed someone immediately, and no one expected a woman, especially one so apparently untested, to take the slot. But Erin wasn't there to explain herself. She was there to do a job, to earn a paycheck, and to keep her head down. She had been told that the foreman, Vic, wouldn't be friendly, and she had prepared herself for that. What she hadn't expected was the quiet humiliation that would sink in within her first hour. As the sun climbed and the air thickened with dust and diesel fumes, the men got to work. Erin was assigned to haul and organize hand tools for the trenching crew. When the time came to distribute the equipment, Vic gestured offhandedly toward a rack of industrial tools, including a hydraulic breaker that needed transporting to the hillside trench. Erin moved toward it, adjusted her gloves, and gripped the handle with both hands. She tried to lift it and staggered backward almost instantly. A couple of the guys snorted. One let out a soft chuckle. Vic said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Erin shook it off, readjusted, and tried again, her arms straining visibly. It was too heavy for a single person to carry easily, especially someone her size, but no one moved to help. Instead, they watched. She managed to drag it halfway to the ATV trailer before she had to pause, panting and red-faced. That was when someone called out from behind her, half mocking, half bemused, asking if she'd ever lifted anything heavier than a coffee mug. The laughter rippled through the crew like an oil slick, slow and suffocating. Erin didn't flinch, didn't even turn. She simply adjusted her shirt, rolled up her right sleeve, and went back to her task. But as the cotton fabric shifted, something caught the attention of one of the younger guys standing closest. Ink. Dark, sharp, unmistakably military. A stylized American flag flanked by mountain wings intertwined with a phrase, RLTW 275ths. The kid's brow furrowed. He blinked, looked again, then muttered something under his breath. Another man heard it and asked what he said. "She's got a Ranger tab. 75th Regiment. 2nd Battalion," the kid answered. That sentence, spoken in a tone now stripped of arrogance, seemed to suck the heat out of the air. The guys didn't laugh again after that. Not because they suddenly understood everything about Erin, but because the tattoo meant something they couldn't ignore. Army Rangers didn't hand out their insignia as fashion statements. Earning that kind of ink required passing through one of the most grueling training programs in the world, the kind that broke down men twice her size. And if she really had been part of the 2nd Battalion of the 75th Ranger Regiment, she hadn't just trained, she'd served at the highest level of tactical combat deployment. That was the kind of experience you couldn't fake. No one said anything right away. Vic looked at her again, longer this time, with eyes that had seen enough to recognize real grit. Erin didn't acknowledge any of it. She just wiped the sweat from her forehead, adjusted the grip on the breaker, and kept dragging it up the trail. The laughter never returned that day, but something else settled into the group, a quiet, humming awareness that the woman they had underestimated wasn't what she seemed. Some of them felt embarrassed, some felt intrigued, one or two felt threatened, but no one doubted her anymore. That was just the beginning. Before she ever stepped onto that dusty work site, Erin Thompson had already been through battles far tougher than steel-toed skepticism and snide remarks. Born and raised in Klamath Falls, Oregon, her life had been carved out of resilience and necessity. Her father, a retired forest firefighter, had passed on before she hit 16, leaving her with a mother whose mind wandered more than it stayed. Erin spent much of her youth bouncing between school, odd jobs, and watching over her younger brother when their mother's episodes became too frequent to ignore. By the time she was 18, Erin wasn't thinking about dreams. She was calculating survival. College wasn't an option. Not because she lacked the intelligence, but because the weight of responsibility had trained her to suppress anything that didn't contribute directly to keeping the family afloat. She had always been strong, but her strength was quiet. She wasn't the type to puff her chest or prove her worth with loud declarations. She built her strength slowly, brick by brick, through silence and repetition. When other girls joined cheer squads, she ran trails and climbed ridgelines, pushing herself without needing applause. By 20, she had already mastered the art of disappearing into a crowd while being the one carrying the heaviest load. She joined the army not because she had romantic visions of heroism, but because it offered structure, purpose, and a paycheck that could eventually support her brother through trade school. But as fate would have it, structure and purpose turned into a battlefield of its own. Erin didn't tell anyone about her decision to go through the Ranger Assessment and Selection Program. It wasn't something she discussed with her unit, and certainly not something she advertised to her family. Most people didn't understand what it meant. Becoming a U.S. Army Ranger wasn't just about proving toughness. It was about surviving a psychological and physical crucible designed to filter out everyone but the most elite. The training broke down hundreds. Only a sliver made it through. Erin was one of them. The second woman in her intake class to complete it, and the only one to be quietly deployed with 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment for a 3-year run. During those years, she learned to operate in darkness, to lead reconnaissance in impossible terrain, to work in complete silence under pressure that would shatter most minds. But when her contract ended, and the military chapter of her life closed, she didn't come home with medals or speeches. She came home quietly, without ceremony, to find that the world she'd left behind had no room for invisible warriors. She didn't want recognition. She wanted a clean slate. Her brother had moved out. Their mother had been placed in long-term care. And the house she had grown up in was falling apart, riddled with weather damage and rot. The military gave her a small stipend and a skill set few civilian employers knew what to do with. And so she drifted from job to job, learning to use her hands in new ways. Manual labor suited her. It asked for effort, not explanations. But in every job site she worked, she encountered the same skeptical eyes, the same assumptions. A small woman with a composed demeanor couldn't possibly be useful in a field that prized brute strength and volume over control and precision. When she landed the temporary placement at the Carson Ridge site, she didn't expect anything different. The ad had asked for strong backs and quick learners. She fit both, even if the crew didn't believe it at first glance. Erin arrived early that day, not to impress anyone, but because punctuality was stitched into her DNA. She had mapped out the job site perimeter the night before, memorized the layout of the terrain, and calculated elevation differences between the gear depot and the trench location uphill. It wasn't her habit to walk in unprepared. Still, despite all her training, nothing could have shielded her from the moment when the jackhammer had slipped through her gloves and clanked awkwardly against the trailer floor. The old insecurities crept in like they always did, the ones born not from failure, but from being underestimated one too many times. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What the crew didn't see, what they couldn't know, was that this wasn't just about lifting tools. This was about reclaiming a sense of self. Erin had spent too long in a world where her capabilities were judged by the slope of her shoulders or the timbre of her voice. It wasn't that she needed their validation. It was that she needed to prove, if only to herself, that the woman who survived blood-soaked deployments and freezing midnight patrols was still inside her. The tattoo on her arm wasn't a badge she wore for pride. It was a quiet anchor, a reminder of who she had been when the world didn't watch her fail at lifting a chunk of metal. And though she hadn't meant for anyone to see it, part of her was glad it had surfaced, because in that tiny ripple of awareness it caused among the crew, she saw the first crack in their judgment. But Erin knew better than to rely on symbolism alone. A tattoo could suggest a past, but it couldn't prove present capability. She would need to work harder than anyone there to regain ground she never should have lost. She would need to show them what true strength looked like, not in muscle, but in willpower. And while the others may have begun to whisper among themselves, questioning who she really was, Erin had already begun to plan her next move, not for attention, but to show what a real ranger did when faced with doubt. This job wasn't a mission, but it mattered just the same, because in a world where people remembered who laughed, but rarely who endured, Erin Thompson was about to remind them all what it looked like to overcome, silently, steadily, and without ever needing to say a word. The construction site at Carson Ridge wasn't much to look at for anyone who didn't know what they were seeing. On the surface, it appeared as just another rocky hillside at the edge of a sprawling Montana pine forest, its ridgeline traced by winding service roads and its soil packed dry with years of erosion. But for the county and its utility contractors, this location was critical. A new series of telecom towers was being installed along a stretch of old Firewatch trails, meant to bring stronger broadband coverage to the outlying homesteads and emergency response units that dotted the dense backcountry. The project had been delayed several times: weather, funding, equipment, and now that spring had finally peeled back the snowpack, the crew was under pressure to push forward with speed. That urgency was part of what made the atmosphere so tense, and why Vic, the site foreman, wasn't thrilled about being sent a fill-in for a position he thought required hardened men with field experience. The staging ground sat in a clearing just below the ridge, surrounded by pine trees that swayed and whispered with every gust of wind that rolled off the higher elevations. There were two gravel paths, one used by machinery and trucks, and the other, narrower and steeper, intended for foot traffic and ATVs hauling lightweight tools up toward the trench zone. The trench itself cut across a rugged slope with scattered boulders and patches of moss that clung stubbornly to the incline, making even the simplest walk an exercise in balance. The men had already spent a week carving a channel deep enough to lay conduit lines, and the next phase required drilling through a rock ledge that had proven far more resistant than the original survey had suggested. Everything about the terrain resisted progress. The high altitude made physical labor feel heavier, the incline demanded careful footing, and the constant, bone-deep wind that howled around midday whipped dust into the men's eyes and lungs. There were no restroom trailers, only a single compost latrine tucked behind the supply shed. Water had to be hauled in by truck. Phone signals were spotty, unless you stood at the far end of the ridge with your phone aimed skyward like a satellite dish. But for the men who worked there, the harshness wasn't a surprise. They were used to it. They prided themselves on handling the elements with minimal complaint. It was one of the few things they respected, toughness born of enduring the land's indifference, that, and loyalty to one another. Outsiders, especially ones who looked soft or uncertain, rarely earned more than a few days' worth of patience. The crew itself was a patchwork of local hires and out-of-town contractors. There was Dean, a heavy equipment operator in his mid-40s who'd been working construction since high school. Rick and Jamal, both former oil field workers who had taken on contract labor after the rigs slowed down in North Dakota, and Mateo, the youngest, barely 21, who still carried the energy of someone with something to prove. Vic, the foreman, was a man in his late 50s, with a jaw set like concrete and hands that had long since calloused over empathy. He wasn't mean, but he didn't offer praise easily. He didn't need his men to like him. He needed the job done right and on time. His expectations were clear: show up early, work until dark, and don't complain unless something was broken or bleeding. He rarely raised his voice, but when he did, it landed like thunder. Every morning started with the same routine. Equipment checks at dawn, brief assignment rundowns by 7, and work beginning no later than 7:30. By 8, the sun crested over the eastern peak and drenched the slope in light, baking the rock face before the crew could even finish their first task. By 10, shirts were soaked through and gloves crusted in grime. There was no shade on the upper trail, and breaks were short, long enough to sip water, not long enough to catch your breath. In that environment, any sign of weakness stood out like a flare. And in Erin's case, her struggle with the jackhammer had become her first impression. The tension that hung around her wasn't overt. No one shouted at her or told her to leave, but every interaction carried the weight of disbelief. The way Rick handed her tools without making eye contact, or how Dean would double-check her measurements after she marked conduit segments for cutting. It wasn't hostility. It was dismissal, wrapped in politeness, made more frustrating by the fact that they didn't even seem aware they were doing it. That subtle undermining was harder to confront than outright conflict. Erin knew it well. It was the kind that crept into your own thinking if you weren't careful, whispering that maybe they were right, maybe you didn't belong. Yet the environment itself, the ridge, the trail, the unrelenting terrain, was familiar to her in ways the men could never guess. She had trained on steeper slopes under heavier loads, in weather twice as brutal, with stakes far beyond a late project deadline. The way the wind twisted through the trees reminded her of patrols through Afghan passes, where silence was life and footing was fate. The physical demands of the site didn't intimidate her. What challenged her now was different. The weight of being seen as unfit, not because of ability, but because of preconception. That kind of resistance required a different kind of strength, the strength to persist without permission. The worksite may have belonged to Vic and his crew in name, but Erin had begun to make her own quiet claim on it. She studied the rhythm of the place, the way the sun shifted shadows across the ledge by midday, how the gear was stored in patterns that made retrieval more efficient, which men took smoke breaks on the dot, and which ones pushed through. She didn't just want to survive the job, she wanted to understand it, to outpace their assumptions with results so undeniable that even Vic would have no choice but to see her. The environment was unforgiving, but it was also honest. It didn't care who she had been, only what she could endure now. And endure she would. The first man to openly challenge her wasn't Vic, though his silence and detachment certainly set the tone. It was Rick, thick-set, early 40s, with a crooked nose and the kind of laugh that came quick and without warmth. He wasn't the loudest man on the crew, but his voice had that particular edge of someone used to being listened to, even when he wasn't saying anything important. A former oil field hand with a bar fight record to match, Rick had carved out a sense of pride in his work through repetition and pain. He valued strength, endurance, and tradition. And in his eyes, Erin threatened all three. It wasn't that he had something against women, he claimed. It was that he had something against people who hadn't earned it. And from the moment Erin dropped the jackhammer, he decided she hadn't. Rick's presence was a constant shadow. He didn't need to shout or bark orders. He worked through insinuation, backhanded remarks, and subtle sabotage. When gear went missing from the trailer, it was always her pile that got shuffled. When tasks were divvied up, he always found a way to assign her the most thankless jobs, under the pretense of teaching her what real work feels like. The others didn't stop him, not because they all agreed, but because no one wanted to get in the middle. Construction sites like Carson Ridge ran on momentum and pecking orders, and Rick had been around long enough to know how to manipulate both. It was during the second week that his tactics escalated. Aaron had been tasked with anchoring a set of cables into a trench wall, a job requiring precision and pressure drilling into solid rock. Vic had given her the go-ahead, assuming someone would be nearby to assist with the heavier components. But when Aaron arrived at the trench site after hauling the gear uphill, she found no one. The cart had been moved, her drill swapped out for an underpowered backup unit, and the placement markers she'd staked the day before had been kicked loose. At first, she thought it might have been an accident. Equipment did get jostled, but then she saw Rick at the crest of the hill, sitting on an overturned bucket, sipping from a thermos, watching. He didn't smile, he didn't scowl, he simply waited. Aaron bent down and began resetting the markers. She worked steadily, forcing her frustration into the rhythm of her task. She redrew her lines, realigned the anchors, and started drilling with the tool she had, compensating for its lack of power by adjusting her angle and bracing technique. It took twice as long. Her forearms burned. The sun was merciless. But she didn't stop. She knew what this was. It wasn't about the drill or the markers. It was about wearing her down, bit by bit, until she either snapped or gave up. Rick wasn't testing her strength. He was testing her spirit. And he wasn't alone. Dean, who'd remained neutral until then, began picking up Rick's tone in subtle ways, checking her work unnecessarily, offering tips with a patronizing slant, making comments about city girls playing soldier. Even Mateo, who had once seemed curious about her past, started keeping his distance. Only Jamal remained mostly silent, but even he seemed resigned to the unfolding dynamic. Rick had taken the reins of perception, and Aaron had been cast in a role she knew all too well, the outsider who was expected to fail. What made it worse was Vic's passive complicity. The foreman had never commented on her performance, not directly. But he didn't step in when Rick cut her off mid-task or reassigned her with a shrug. He didn't question the missing gear or the switched assignments. In Vic's mind, it seemed, things would settle themselves. And maybe they would have, if Aaron had been anyone else. But Aaron wasn't here to be accepted. She was here to do a job. And she'd faced down men like Rick before. Not just in training, but in combat units, where doubt could be deadly and where earning trust required more than muscle. It required showing up every day, prepared, consistent, unflinching. She knew this wasn't just about the trench or the anchor bolts. This was about something deeper, an unspoken rule that a woman in this space had to be twice as competent to be considered half as capable. And Aaron had long since stopped flinching at that unfair math. What Rick didn't know, what Vic couldn't see, was that every insult, every obstacle only refined her focus. She logged every sabotage attempt mentally, every misdirected order, every glance of disbelief. Not as a grudge, but as data. This wasn't personal, it was systemic. And Aaron had no intention of fighting it with confrontation. She'd fight it the only way she knew how, with performance so undeniable that even her doubters would have to look twice. But as the days wore on, the tension deepened. Rick's tactics became bolder. He once accidentally spilled diesel near her workstation, forcing her to halt drilling for an hour. Another time, he rewrote her delivery notes, rerouting her gear, and blaming a paperwork error. It was harassment in plain sight, but in a place like Carson Ridge, where complaints traveled slower than weather fronts, the only solution was outworking the game. And that was exactly what Aaron planned to do. What none of them realized was that while they were pushing her down, they were also revealing something about themselves. Their need to mock, to test, to gatekeep. It was less about her and more about the fragile identities they clung to. Aaron didn't need their validation, but they desperately needed someone like her to fail. Because if she didn't, Then everything they believed about toughness, about worthiness, about their place in the world would be called into question. And Erin Thompson wasn't just going to survive their gauntlet, she was going to redefine it. The days fell into a predictable rhythm, each one echoing the last with quiet hostility and unspoken challenges. Erin would arrive first, her boots crunching the gravel path while the others were still downing their last sips of lukewarm coffee. She'd check the equipment without being told, inventory the gear with the precision of someone who knew how critical small oversights could become, and begin her work before anyone else had even lifted a wrench. Rick and the others would follow a half-hour later, loud in their banter and slow in their movement, their eyes always drifting toward her like they were waiting for her to slip up again. And every day, without fail, they gave her a new hoop to jump through, one crafted from subtle sleights and engineered inconvenience. One morning it was a cable spool that had been left loosely wound, the tension carefully manipulated so it would tangle the moment she tried to unwind it. Another day, it was a tampered measurement on the survey rod, throwing off her alignment by inches and nearly forcing her to re-drill a full row of anchors. When she confronted the tools, she did so in silence, never accusing, never pointing fingers. She simply corrected, adapted, and moved forward. But with each act of sabotage she unraveled and resolved, something began to shift, not in them, but in her. She was growing sharper, more efficient, less vulnerable to the doubt that had first crept in that day with the jackhammer. Their pettiness became a training course in disguise, and Erin met each new test with the hardened calm of a soldier in a live exercise. The men didn't understand the depth of her endurance, because none of them knew where it had been forged. They thought grit was defined by how much you could lift, or how long you could push through sun and sweat before asking for water. They didn't know what it meant to carry a wounded comrade for 3 miles through hostile terrain, or to stay awake for 72 hours on reconnaissance, with only adrenaline and mission focus to sustain you. They had never scrubbed blood from their uniforms in silence, or stared down an IED route with a calm so deep it felt like numbness. Erin had, and every passive-aggressive ploy they threw her way was just a whisper compared to the roar of what she'd already survived. But routine has a way of revealing people, not just through what they do, but through what they repeat, and Rick repeated everything, every eye roll, every scoff when she triple-checked torque specs, every comment laced with sarcasm disguised as advice. "Maybe you're better off doing the inventory today," he'd mutter loud enough for others to hear, implying she belonged with clipboards and spreadsheets, not heavy gear and grit. Dean followed suit, adding comments like, "Careful on that ridge. Wouldn't want you sliding off with all that fancy training." Even Mateo, once neutral, seemed to linger near Rick more often now, laughing at jokes that weren't funny and nodding at criticisms he didn't fully understand. But the irony was, Erin was getting better, much better. Her precision with measurements and gear adjustments began to surpass even Dean's. She identified a flaw in the alignment of a trench segment before it became a full-blown structural issue, something Rick had missed entirely while boasting about the speed of his drill team. She rerouted the placement of a cable array after recognizing a slope risk that hadn't shown up on the outdated elevation scans. When the supplier dropped off a mislabeled shipment, it was Erin who caught the serial discrepancies and stopped a full day of wasted work. She didn't announce these victories. She didn't need to. The crew noticed. They just didn't acknowledge them, at least not out loud. Instead, they doubled down. One morning, she arrived to find her gloves missing, not misplaced, gone. Someone had taken them from the gear locker she always used. She said nothing. She borrowed a spare pair, too big for her hands, and continued laying cable without pause. The next day, her lunchbox was unlatched and left exposed under the sun. The food spoiled. She didn't complain. She drank water and pressed on. Then came the day Rick accidentally dumped fill gravel over the trench segment she had just reinforced, undoing hours of measured work. Still, she didn't lash out. She redid it, silently, more carefully than before. Her response was unchanging. consistent, relentless. And it was that relentlessness that began to get under their skin, not because it made her look better, but because it made their efforts look small. They had set a stage for failure, and she had turned it into a proving ground. It wasn't just endurance, it was discipline, the kind they didn't understand, because it wasn't born from the need to impress anyone. It was born from mission-first living, the kind of mental wiring forged in fire, failure, and silence. By the third week, even Vic started watching her more closely. He never said anything, never gave praise or critique, but his eyes lingered longer during her morning gear checks. He started assigning her to more critical tasks, not in a gesture of respect, but perhaps to see how far she could really go before breaking, and she welcomed it. Every assignment was a chance to chip away at the wall that separated her from their respect. She didn't need their friendship. She didn't need a place at their table. She just needed the work to speak louder than the ridicule. Yet underneath it all, a quiet pressure was building. The pattern of testing, the constant tension, the unspoken war of attrition, it was all leading to something. Erin could feel it. Rick wasn't the type to let go once he'd set his sights on someone. His ego had taken a hit each time she succeeded, where he had expected her to stumble. And egos, bruised too often, tend to look for one big moment to strike back, to reassert dominance. Erin didn't know when it would come, or how, but she knew one thing for sure. If he pushed, she'd push back. Not with fists or threats, but with the kind of truth you couldn't ignore, the kind you couldn't sabotage, the kind that earned silence, respect, and finally, change. She wasn't there to win a war. She was there to finish a job. But sometimes, just doing that job better than anyone else was how you won the war no one else knew was happening. Cassidy didn't sleep much that night, not out of exhaustion, but from the adrenaline that still pulsed through her veins like wildfire. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind rattling the frame, brought her back to the weight of the concrete bag slamming onto the gravel and the chorus of laughter that followed. She stared at the ceiling, counting the faint shadows made by the moonlight leaking through the window, her mind going back and forth between the humbling slap of humiliation and the stronger, deeper ache of something more personal, being underestimated. It wasn't just about the physical weight of the materials, it was about the heaviness of being seen as weak, irrelevant, or out of place. That was what stung most. Still, morning came as it always did, indifferent to bruised pride or restless nights. Cassidy was up before the alarm she didn't set, moving quietly through the small kitchen as she brewed a pot of black coffee, her routine crisp, deliberate, focused. She pulled her hair into a tight braid, laced up her boots, and wrapped the blue bandana around her wrist like she always did, one of the few rituals from her ranger days that still lived with her. When she stepped outside into the cool morning air, she inhaled deeply, grounding herself not just in the dirt beneath her boots but in something older, tougher, and forged by discipline. She reminded herself, she was trained for pressure, built for challenge, and more than capable of holding her own. If they needed proof, they'd get it. Just not the way they expected. The site was already stirring when she arrived, trucks pulling in and men unloading pallets of steel framing and bags of gypsum board. Jack was by the supply trailer scribbling into a clipboard, and though he didn't say much as she walked by, his eyes flickered toward her with that same doubtful curiosity. She greeted him with a nod, grabbed a pair of gloves, and went straight to work without waiting for orders or instructions. Her silence spoke volumes. The tasks that morning were relentless, moving long sheets of drywall, mixing cement in wheelbarrows, navigating uneven ground while balancing planks and boards. Cassidy didn't seek attention. She just worked. She moved with a quiet precision that had a rhythm to it, her posture clean, her lifts methodical, her focus unshakable. At first, the others barely noticed, too caught up in their own assignments. But eventually, one by one, glances began to flicker in her direction. By mid-morning, she was stationed with two others, Rex and Benny, near the cement mixer, tasked with helping haul sandbags, across a path that was already riddled with mud. Benny, older and more easygoing, offered to take 2 at a time, while Rex, still holding on to his alpha facade, rolled his eyes and muttered something about how Cassidy should just supervise. Cassidy didn't respond. She crouched, wrapped her arms around 2 sandbags, then stood with perfect balance and strode across the slick path. By the time she returned, she grabbed 2 more. Then again, and again. No struggle, no flinch, just resolve. It wasn't long before Benny chuckled under his breath and nudged Rex, who watched with narrowed eyes and a slight frown. Eventually, Benny muttered to Rex that if they weren't careful, she'd outpace them by lunch. But it wasn't just the lifting. Cassidy moved with intention. She knew how to angle her body to reduce strain, how to shift weight using leverage instead of brute force. When one of the younger guys, Mason, twisted his ankle stepping into a sunken patch of earth, Cassidy was the first one there. She assessed his footing, adjusted his weight, and used a brace hold that eased him back to level ground. She muttered a quick assessment of his ankle's swelling and even suggested compression. Mason blinked at her, bewildered, asking if she had some kind of medical training. She shrugged and said nothing, her eyes already scanning the area for other risks. But Mason kept watching her as she walked away, something shifting in his expression. Not mockery, not even surprise, more like curiosity laced with respect. As the day wore on, Cassidy's tattoo, usually hidden beneath her shirt sleeve, began to peek through as the heat rose, and she rolled up her sleeves to the shoulder. Heine. The black ink, a simple emblem intertwined with coordinates and a Roman numeral, didn't say Ranger outright, but to those who knew, those who'd served or trained or simply paid attention, it was unmistakable. It didn't scream for attention, it whispered authority. And the moment Rex caught sight of it as she leaned forward to pick up a crate of fittings, his face faltered. His gaze lingered longer than usual, brows knitting together in confusion. Then something like recognition. He didn't say anything at first, just stared. Then later, during the water break, he subtly pulled Jack aside and muttered something, gesturing slightly toward Cassidy. Jack's eyes widened just a bit, then narrowed. Cassidy noticed from the corner of her eye, but pretended not to. She kept sipping her water, wiping the sweat from her brow and stretching her shoulders in preparation for the second half of the day. But the ripple had already started. What began as laughter and doubt had turned into an undercurrent of questions, then murmurs. And though no one asked her directly, yet there was a shift in tone. Fewer jokes, more eye contact, a different kind of silence when she walked by. Cassidy didn't need them to like her. She didn't even need them to understand her. But they were starting to see her, not as the outsider fumbling with heavy gear, but as something else. And by the end of that day, when Jack approached her and asked if she'd mind helping train 2 new guys on safety protocol for the jackhammers, it wasn't a test. It was a quiet recognition. And she nodded, still saying little, still holding her center with a calm built through years of proving herself where no one thought she belonged. She wasn't done yet. Not even close. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of unpredictable challenges and subtle transformations that no one in the crew quite expected, least of all Peyton herself. The day after the incident with the pipe, there was a noticeable shift in how people looked at her, not outright friendly, not yet respectful, but no longer dripping with open disdain either. It was more like cautious curiosity, as if they were trying to recalibrate the assumptions they had all made too quickly. Peyton didn't bask in this new attention. Instead, she returned to the site the next morning like she had every morning before. Boots laced tight, shoulders squared, jaw set. But beneath that quiet intensity, something in her eyes had changed. It wasn't defiance anymore. It was determination laced with something deeper, something that told the crew she wasn't going anywhere, not now, not ever. Travis, the foreman, noticed it first. He watched her lift coils of cable that weighed as much as a full-grown man, maneuvering them with controlled effort, her movements precise and practiced. He saw how she used leverage and momentum, not just brute strength, and how she never asked for help, even when others clearly would have. And more than once, he caught her quietly correcting errors made by others, rerouting an excavator path that would have collided with a buried line, tightening bolts that hadn't been torqued enough, triple-checking measurements when no one was watching. At first, he chalked it up to luck, but after a week of this silent competence, Travis had to admit, Peyton wasn't just decent at this, she was damn good. Still, not everyone was ready to let go of their assumptions. Nate, who had been the loudest voice in mocking her during the first days, couldn't quite let go of his bruised ego. Every time she excelled, he doubled down, throwing little digs into conversations when she was near. When Peyton carried a full drum of sealant across a sloped patch of gravel, Nate made a point of whispering that she probably had help off camera. When she fixed the hydraulic leak on the skid steer, he muttered that someone else must have walked her through it. Peyton never responded, and that unnerved him more than he'd admit. There was a stillness in her silence, an unshakable calm that made his words feel hollow as soon as they left his mouth. One afternoon, as a thunderstorm loomed in the distance, the crew was rushing to get the new truss beams installed before the rain made the equipment too slick to handle. Peyton volunteered to rig the upper clamps, while balanced on a narrow steel platform 20 feet above ground. No one else offered to join her. Travis hesitated, thinking of the liability, but when she clipped in with flawless form and moved across the beam like she'd been born on steel, he gave her the nod. The sky grumbled as she moved swiftly, securing the crossbars while the wind picked up. Her movements were efficient, almost elegant, and when she finished, she rappelled down the column faster than any of them had ever seen someone descend. She hit the ground with a thud, unlatched her harness, and nodded to Travis. The rain began 2 minutes later. That evening, word of her climb traveled fast, not just because it was daring, but because she had done it with such unshaken precision. A few of the younger crew members approached her during the break, not with sarcasm or skepticism this time, but with genuine questions. How had she learned to tie off that fast? What rigging technique was that? Where had she learned to rappel like that without a hint of fear? Peyton didn't boast. She simply answered, revealing bits and pieces of her past in short, clipped sentences. She had trained with the Rangers, yes. She had completed survival courses in terrain worse than this. She had built rope bridges across ravines with nothing but paracord and ingenuity. And yes, she had seen men twice her size buckle under the stress she had carried for years. But it wasn't the bragging that left an impression. It was the humility with which she said it all. No ego, no need to dominate the space, just facts, offered plainly. That night, for the first time, she wasn't the last to be called for dinner at the site's communal mess trailer. In fact, one of the crew, young Theo, barely 20, saved her a seat. She accepted it with a small nod, but inside, something flickered to life. She hadn't realized how much she missed the warmth of shared effort, of a team that, even loosely, began to resemble camaraderie. Later that week, Travis pulled her aside. He didn't bother with small talk. Instead, he handed her a clipboard. She scanned the form. It was an internal evaluation sheet, something they only gave to candidates being considered for site leads or heavy equipment team supervisors. Peyton raised an eyebrow, and Travis just shrugged. "Just fill it out," he said. "I've been around long enough to spot talent. Doesn't matter what it looks like, or how long it's been overlooked. You're the real thing." For a moment, Peyton felt the burn of emotion creep up her throat, but she swallowed it back down and nodded. Recognition wasn't her fuel, but it didn't mean it didn't matter. What no one realized was that Peyton's tattoo had become more than just a mark of her past. It had become a quiet symbol of her present. No one mocked it anymore. In fact, a few asked her what it meant, and she told them, finally. It wasn't about war or toughness or proving anything to anyone. It was about discipline, about being the last to quit and the first to show up. It was about listening more than speaking, and letting your actions write your reputation before your mouth ever opened. It was about surviving, adapting, and thriving, especially when no one believed you could. By the end of that week, the tone of the crew had changed entirely. Peyton wasn't just accepted, she was valued. Her journey, though far from over, had taken a powerful turn. She had come to the site as an outsider. Now, she was the quiet force holding the team's respect together, one flawlessly executed task at a time. For weeks after that day at the supply yard, Kala had stepped into a different version of herself. The act of lifting the generator alone hadn't just broken expectations, it had cracked something wide open inside her. People now regarded her with a curious mixture of admiration and caution, as though they were still trying to reconcile the image of the quiet, tattooed woman with the mental picture they had of Army Rangers. But Kala didn't lean into their awe. Instead, she leaned into the work, the routine, the rhythm of it all. She stopped responding to the stares and half-whispered speculations and focused instead on the tangible tasks that filled her hands and kept her mind anchored. Every early morning began the same, boots tied, gloves pulled tight, and a long swig of the bitter coffee from the dusty machine in the break room. While others were still yawning or stretching off the sleep, Kala was already by the loading dock, reviewing the day's dispatch. Supervisors began to quietly trust her with more physically demanding jobs, and even the most skeptical of the team couldn't help but take note when she repaired the hydraulic line on a malfunctioning loader faster than the certified mechanic. Yet despite the shift in dynamics, her walls remained firmly intact. No one on the crew could say they knew her beyond the job. She kept conversations minimal and businesslike. There were still no stories about her past, no casual laughter over lunches, no commiseration over long shifts. That detachment became both her armor and her challenge. People respected her, but they didn't approach her, not out of cruelty anymore, but out of uncertainty. That didn't matter to her, or at least, that's what she told herself. That is, until she met Byron. Byron was a recent hire, brought on during a particularly hectic stretch of orders. He wasn't like the others. He didn't posture or bark jokes meant to put others down. He was observant, careful, a bit older than most of the crew, and had the quiet calm of someone who'd lived through harder days than he needed to advertise. Kala noticed immediately how he didn't rush to form cliques, or act like he knew it all. He watched, he asked smart questions, and he kept pace without trying to prove something. One rainy Thursday afternoon, as they worked together unloading a late shipment of pressure washers, Kala found herself startled by how easily the silence between them felt unthreatening. It wasn't strained or awkward, it was just shared focus. And when Byron finally did speak, it wasn't to point out something she'd done or ask about the tattoo that had become a subject of fascination for others. He simply said, "You moved with good flow on that dolly, like someone trained to think 5 steps ahead." That comment, so ordinary and yet perceptive, landed in her chest in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time in months, she offered something in return. Force of habit. Worked with timed drills before. She hadn't meant to say it. The words escaped before she could censor them, and for a second she braced for the questions that would follow, but none came. Byron just nodded, like he understood, and returned to strapping the units in place. That was the beginning of a strange, tentative thread forming between them. It was never verbalized, never labeled, but it grew over the days that followed. They'd find themselves paired up for jobs more often than not, sometimes by chance, other times by what seemed like quiet planning from the supervisors, who'd begun to notice that together they moved like gears in the same machine, efficient and unspoken in their coordination. Then one day, in the middle of a long haul involving a massive trenching tool and a complicated delivery route, a tire blew out on their transport vehicle, halfway across a deserted road by the ridge. With no signal and a storm creeping over the hills, it could have been a miserable delay. But instead of frustration, Kala and Byron fell into a rhythm, jacking the axle, swapping the spare, securing the load again, all without a single complaint. And afterward, soaked and greasy but satisfied with the job done, they sat in the cab, and shared a thermos of lukewarm tea. That's when Byron finally said, "I figured it out." Calla raised an eyebrow, saying nothing. "Your tattoo," he continued, nodding toward the ink that ran just under the sleeve of her shirt. "The wings and the blade. That's Ranger Regiment, isn't it?" She didn't confirm. She didn't have to. He nodded again, as though it was an answer to questions he hadn't asked aloud. "I had a buddy in 3rd Battalion. Said the women who made it through were tougher than most of the men who didn't." Calla gave the faintest of smiles, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Byron didn't push. Instead, he said, "It explains the way you lead under pressure. Not barking orders, but making people want to move with you." That comment, too, settled in her chest like a warm stone. She realized then that Byron didn't see her as a novelty or a legend. He saw her as a person, one with a past, one whose strengths had context. That subtle recognition did more to crack the shell around her heart than any dramatic act could have. When they returned to the yard that evening, their delay explained and documented, Calla found herself lingering by the lockers instead of heading straight for her truck. She looked over at Byron and, after a beat, simply said, "You free this weekend? There's a veterans thing at the VFW. Low-key. Not a big crowd." Byron nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "I'd like that." It was the first time she had invited anyone into her world outside of work, and though the step was small, it marked the quiet beginning of something far more personal. The return of connection, of shared space, of trust. Not because anyone had forced her to explain herself, but because someone had finally chosen to simply understand. That shift, quiet, mutual, unspoken, began to ripple into the weeks that followed in ways neither of them could yet foresee. What followed that morning was a calm before the storm, the kind of deceptive peace that masks the unraveling that waits just around the corner. Clara arrived at work before anyone else, choosing solitude over the uncomfortable tension that had filled the past few days. Her boots echoed lightly across the concrete as she checked the equipment logs, preparing for a new delivery that was due to arrive around midday. While her face remained composed, inside she carried the fresh sting of what had occurred. The mocking, the assumptions, the disbelief. The tattoo on her forearm had spoken louder than any words she could have ever uttered, and yet somehow it only cracked the surface. Her coworkers were still in that uneasy space between awe and skepticism, unsure how to reconcile their biased views with what they had witnessed. Clara didn't intend to convince them. That was never her goal. Her focus remained the same as it always had: get the job done, with integrity and without compromising herself. But what she couldn't predict was how fast the test of all she'd ever learned would come barreling toward them in ways that no amount of planning could prevent. By 10:30 that morning, the heat had become stifling, the kind of heavy air that hung like a warning. Clara stood outside by the east side of the lot, inspecting an older piece of equipment that had been flagged the day before for malfunctioning hydraulics. As she leaned in, clipboard in hand, a distant rumble grew louder behind the tree line that bordered the north edge of the site. It was too rhythmic to be thunder. Clara turned her head and squinted. Then she saw it, a flatbed truck coming in faster than it should, bouncing as if unbalanced. A second later, the radio on her belt crackled to life with urgency. It was the dispatch clerk's voice, strained and rapid, confirming what Clara had just realized. The brakes had failed on a new delivery truck carrying over 12 tons of steel piping, and it was headed straight into the worksite perimeter. There were men working near the inbound path, completely unaware of what was coming. Without hesitation, Clara dropped the clipboard and sprinted. Her feet pounded the ground with the precision of someone trained to react under fire. Her eyes locked on the route the truck would likely take if it didn't slow. She activated the emergency siren near the equipment shed mid-run, warning others that something was wrong. Her fellow workers scattered in confusion, some running away from the commotion while others froze, looking toward the source of the danger. Clara didn't stop. She scaled a pile of gravel, gaining higher ground, and from that perch, she could see the trajectory more clearly. The truck's driver was trying everything. He was slamming the horn, jerking the wheel, but the load had shifted unevenly and gravity was doing the rest. The incline the truck had descended was now a death slide. Thinking fast, Clara remembered a temporary barrier set up near the excavation pit. It was reinforced with sandbags and steel rails, designed for low-impact containment, but still solid enough if used strategically. She signaled two nearby crewmen, who were staring wide-eyed, instructing them to help her dislodge the rails and drag them into a staggered formation. They obeyed, more out of shock than anything else, and in less than 30 seconds, Clara had them position the barriers into a curved slope that could redirect the truck's momentum. It was a risky maneuver, one that depended on precise timing and the hope that the impact would be distributed instead of absorbed directly. Just as the truck crossed the final stretch of gravel and threatened to plow into the side-loading bay, it hit the angled rails Clara had helped set. The truck lurched, metal screeched, and in an explosion of dust and tension, the vehicle tipped onto its side, skidding violently, but slowing enough to stop short of the main warehouse. Silence followed, brief, stunned silence. Then the workers who had scattered began to emerge from their hiding spots. The driver crawled from the truck's window, shaken but alive. Clara stood nearby, her forearms still dust-covered, but her tattoo faintly visible beneath the dirt and sweat. The emblem of the Ranger Unit, a mark of resilience, quick thinking, and above all, leadership in chaos, gleamed faintly under the sunlight. For a long moment, no one said anything. And then, slowly, a ripple of realization moved through the crowd. What they had just witnessed wasn't luck, it wasn't guessing. It was training, it was poise under pressure. And it was Clara. The supervisor arrived breathless from the south wing and immediately scanned the scene, taking in the halted disaster, the trembling driver, the dislodged barriers, and Clara standing amidst it all like the eye of a storm. He walked over, face pale, and before he could speak, the driver, still shaking, pointed at Clara and said that if she hadn't been there, he would have plowed into everyone, and they'd be talking body counts instead of property damage. The weight of that statement hung heavy. This time, no one second-guessed it. No one chuckled under their breath. No one questioned why she had reacted the way she did. They knew, and even the few who still harbored their doubts felt them disintegrate like smoke. Clara, however, didn't gloat. She didn't seek validation. She simply nodded to the supervisor and started checking on the other workers, making sure everyone was accounted for. She asked the site medic to assess the driver, then requested a full safety inspection be initiated before operations resumed. The authority in her tone no longer sparked resentment. It sparked respect. The air had shifted. A hierarchy that had once resisted her presence now silently recognized it. The tattoo had told part of the story, but Clara's actions that day had told the rest, and it spoke volumes. It was around that time when a sudden shift in perception began, not loudly, not with announcements or applause, but in hushed conversations behind tent flaps, in nods exchanged over equipment stations. In the subtle way some of the men started glancing at Delaney with a measure of curiosity instead of contempt. During one of the scheduled loadout exercises, where every trainee had to disassemble and reassemble a mock supply line under time pressure, she moved with a rhythm that was surprisingly elegant, like muscle memory had kicked in and taken over. It was in the way her hands tightened straps, looped carabiners, secured crates, and navigated terrain with an awareness no textbook could teach. Kevin watched from a distance as she hoisted a bulky generator component solo while others fumbled with smaller crates in pairs. There was no flexing, no showboating. She just got it done. That moment started circulating among the group, especially after someone noticed a particular tattoo on her upper forearm, barely visible under the sleeve of her uniform. A faded yet intricate symbol, a black dagger interlaced with a mountain range encircled by a wreath. It wasn't flashy, but to those who knew, it was unmistakable, the Ranger crest. Kevin didn't say anything that day, but his expression had noticeably shifted. There was a flicker of recognition, of reevaluation, maybe even unease. He didn't confront her, but he did take a step back during their usual sarcastic exchanges, and that alone said more than words. Rumors spread like brush fire. Some of the newer recruits began asking quiet questions. Was Delaney military? Was that tattoo real or just decorative? How did she learn to handle a 5-ton loader like she was born in its cockpit? Delaney never answered them directly. She'd always offer a small smile, shrug it off, or redirect the topic entirely. For her, the focus remained on the work. She didn't want to earn respect by feeding into gossip. She wanted to prove herself on her own terms, without relying on past glory or medals. But fate, or perhaps inevitability, had different plans. It was during the advanced terrain hauling drill when everything snapped into clarity for everyone present. The assignment was straightforward on paper but a nightmare in execution. Each team was required to move a half-ton crate across a 3-mile uphill trail, with switchbacks, loose gravel, and no direct vehicle access. Most teams had 3 to 4 members and were given mechanical dollies or skids. But due to a last-minute equipment shortage, Delaney's team was left with minimal gear and only 2 members. Her partner was Jason, the quiet newcomer who'd recently torn his shoulder during a fall and was benched for most of the lift. While most teams grumbled, Delaney didn't flinch. She studied the terrain, scouted the path, reinforced the crate with strapping belts, and started building a custom makeshift harness using leftover cable lines and padding. It took her less than 20 minutes to create a frame, loop it over her back like a backpack, and begin dragging the crate herself. One by one, conversations died down as others noticed what she was doing. Her boots dug into the dirt as the incline steepened. Every tendon in her legs and neck was straining, sweat pouring down her back like rainwater. Yet she didn't pause. Her breathing was controlled, her focus razor-sharp. Even the instructors halted their checklists to observe. She wasn't moving fast, but she was moving, relentlessly, without stopping, up a trail where even teams of 4 were stumbling. By the time she reached the halfway mark, a small crowd had gathered along the sidelines. No one dared to intervene. There was something sacred in what was happening, something raw and primal that echoed through everyone watching. The sun pierced through the tree canopy above, spotlighting her frame just as her shirt slipped slightly, revealing the full extent of the ranger tattoo on her shoulder blade. It was undeniable now. The room, or rather the entire training field, shifted. Kevin stood among the watchers, arms crossed, silent. His smirk had long vanished. In its place, there was a complicated mix of emotions: respect, guilt, maybe even admiration. Delaney reached the top of the trail after nearly 50 minutes of uninterrupted hauling. Her face was flushed, her breathing labored, and her shoulders trembled from the weight. But she stood upright, let the crate rest, and saluted the instructor who'd been timing her. No fanfare, no victory speech, just silent accomplishment. The kind that didn't need witnesses but had them anyway. Later that evening, as the team gathered in the mess tent for debrief, the air was different. People spoke to her directly, asked her opinion, shared stories. Jason quietly handed her a cold drink and whispered that she was the toughest person he'd ever met. No more sarcastic nicknames. No more backhanded jokes. Even Kevin approached her near the equipment bay with a quiet, sincere nod. He didn't apologize, at least not in words, but his tone softened as he admitted they'd underestimated her. She simply nodded, not out of smugness, but because she already knew. That wasn't the validation she came for, but it was enough. As the fire pit crackled under the night sky, and the stars glimmered above the outpost, Delaney finally allowed herself to exhale. Not because she had proven something to others, but because she had reclaimed something in herself, something vital, hard-earned, and indestructible. The mood in the construction yard had shifted from suspicion to something resembling awe, but Georgia didn't bask in the attention. She kept her focus squarely on the job at hand, her posture steady and movements deliberate as she adjusted the trench measurements, realigned the beams, and ensured every bolt was perfectly torqued. The team, once wary and dismissive, now followed her lead with the kind of silent respect earned only by those who prove themselves in the crucible of performance. Her ranger training had become more than a tattooed tale from the past. It was now a living force guiding her present. Still, the job wasn't over. The storm had only made things worse in the valley. Floodwaters had begun to pool near the foundation of the residential site, threatening the integrity of the very base they had poured just 2 weeks ago. What had begun as a joke about her handling the pump truck alone now became a desperate call for her insight. She didn't hesitate. Georgia waded through the knee-high water in her heavy gear, drawing on her military memories of how to redirect water during emergency deployments. She barked out quick, precise instructions. Dig here, reinforce that slope, build a drainage channel there. The team scrambled to keep up, but there was no longer any question of whether or not they should listen. Her commands came fast, like muscle memory born from a lifetime of drills, and the men executed them without complaint. The foreman, Vince, who had previously tolerated her presence with a kind of strained indifference, was now calling her Sarge and checking every step with her before making a move. By sundown, they had not only salvaged the site, but improved the layout with a secondary water outflow path she had designed, with nothing but sticks, her boot, and the gradient of the land. No blueprints, no survey team, just instinct and grit. Later that night, the crew sat around the fire pit near their temporary housing, too exhausted for their usual poker or booze-fueled banter. The silence wasn't tense, it was contemplative. And then, almost without cue, one of the younger workers, Louise, looked over at Georgia and asked how she had joined the Rangers. It was the first time any of them had directly asked. For a moment, she considered brushing it off with a joke, or giving them the official bio they could find online if they cared to look. But something about the rawness in their eyes, the acknowledgement, the curiosity, maybe even admiration, made her pause. She told them about growing up in a steel town with a mother who worked 3 jobs and a father who disappeared before she could say his name properly. She spoke of a life spent constantly overlooked, always underestimated, until the day she walked into a recruitment office on a dare and found herself shipped off to Fort Benning 2 weeks later. She described the early years, the mud, the yelling, the endless push-ups, and the pain of always being the last picked, the smallest in the unit. But she had stayed. She had endured. Not because she was stronger than anyone else, but because quitting was a luxury she couldn't afford. She recounted missions that weren't in the papers, recon work in dangerous territories, extraction runs under gunfire, the weight of decisions that could never be undone. The men listened in stunned silence. And then she told them about leaving, not because she was forced out, but because she had something else to prove, that she could be more than her past, more than her rank, more than her scars. That's when the real work began. Civilian life wasn't easier. It was lonelier, filled with people who couldn't fathom what she had seen or done. The construction job had been just another mountain to climb, and yes, she had heard every sneer and snide comment along the way. But it didn't matter now. Because the only thing that ever had mattered was showing up and doing the work better than anyone else. When she finished, there was no applause, no congratulations, just silence. And then Luis, the youngest and formerly cockiest of the crew, simply nodded and said he hoped his sister grew up to be like her. It was the kind of comment that hit harder than any metal. Vince cleared his throat and mumbled something about her taking point tomorrow, not just for formality's sake, but because everyone agreed she was the only one qualified. Georgia nodded, smiled faintly, and looked at the glowing embers of the fire as if they held the memories of all the challenges that had led her here. She didn't need validation anymore. The battlefield had changed, but the mission remained the same: lead by example, endure with integrity, and never, ever let the weight of others' doubts become heavier than your own belief. As the night wore on, and one by one the crew drifted to their bunks, Georgia sat a while longer, listening to the wind hum across the open field, her fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of the tattoo on her arm. It wasn't just ink, it was a map, a legacy, a quiet promise. The story wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. On the second night after the incident with the generator, Maddie found herself unable to sleep. She paced around her temporary quarters, replaying the day's events in her mind. The tentative change in some of the crew's attitudes had started to show. Riley, for one, had actually nodded at her as they passed each other by the food truck, and that simple gesture, insignificant to an outsider, felt like the tiniest glimmer of progress. Still, there was a mountain to climb. One successful day didn't erase weeks of cold shoulders, crude comments, and dismissive glances. The momentary validation only made her crave something more lasting. She knew the real change would come not from a single act of strength, but from consistency, from grit. Morning broke with heavy clouds and distant thunder, a perfect mirror to Maddie's state of mind. As the foreman gathered the team, he mentioned a storm alert. Flash floods were possible in the canyons to the north, and some of their equipment stationed along the lower ridges would need to be pulled in or reinforced. Volunteers were requested, and predictably, no one rushed forward. The task was dangerous, exhausting, and logistically complex. Maddie stepped forward without hesitation. Logan looked at her skeptically, as if expecting her to back out once she realized what it involved. When she didn't, he muttered something to the effect of, "Let her learn the hard way," and approved her for the lead. 2 hours later, she found herself gripping the wheel of a battered utility truck, her gloves damp and her uniform stained with dust and oil. Beside her sat Nate, who had been assigned as her secondary support, though he barely spoke. He tapped away at the GPS system, updating their location as they bounced over rocks and shallow trenches. The silence between them was thick, but not hostile. It felt more like uncertainty, as if Nate wasn't sure how to treat her anymore. That was progress too. When they reached the lower ridge, the sky had begun to bruise into deeper grays. The wind howled between the canyons, and every gust carried the scent of rain and soil. They had roughly 90 minutes, maybe less, to secure the solar batteries and retract the drone station before runoff could sweep through. Maddie sprang into action, checking latches, lifting metal plates, and tying down gear with the kind of speed that suggested not just competence, but anticipation, and awareness of how unpredictable wilderness conditions could become. Nate watched her, visibly puzzled by how composed and prepared she was. He tried to match her pace, but within 20 minutes, he was winded, his shirt soaked through with sweat and grime. As Maddie secured the last battery case, thunder cracked overhead, and the first drops began to fall. Nate called out that the canyon sensors were reading rapid moisture buildup. They had to go. Maddie secured the last tarp over the gear and gave him a nod. "Go, I'll lock the container," she said, moving with speed and accuracy. He hesitated for a moment, then turned and jogged to the truck. She followed seconds later, vaulting into the passenger side, just as the rain began to fall in earnest. They drove back in silence again, but this time, the air between them had shifted. Nate looked over at her a couple of times, visibly struggling to reconcile the woman beside him with the stereotypes he'd once accepted. Finally, as the truck bumped over the last incline before the main camp came into view, he broke the silence. "Where did you learn to move like that?" he asked, not with accusation, but curiosity. Maddie looked out the window, considering whether to tell him. Eventually, she said, "Ranger training. Before I got into heavy equipment ops, I spent 3 years doing tactical navigation, emergency evac drills, and terrain rescues. This stuff, it's like muscle memory." When they arrived, the rest of the team was still prepping sandbags and elevation guards. Riley jogged up to them, anxious. "You made it before the flood warnings came through," he said, genuine relief in his voice. Maddie simply nodded and got out, immediately joining the rest of the team to continue storm prep. It was as if she didn't want to let anyone assume her effort was over. She wasn't here for applause. She was here to work. Later that night, with the storm contained and the site secured, Logan walked into the central operations tent, where Maddie sat reviewing footage from the drone survey. He watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Not bad out there," he said. She looked up. His face was unreadable. "If you can keep that up, I might actually believe you belong out here." It wasn't praise. Not really. But coming from Logan, it was practically an endorsement. She gave a slight smile. "Don't worry," she replied. "I'm just getting started." What she didn't see was the subtle change in the eyes of the men around her. They didn't just see her as a woman who had survived tough conditions. They were beginning to see her as a leader, someone who could be relied on when things went south. Someone they would trust, not just with physical labor, but with their safety. And for Maddie, that shift meant more than any compliment could. It meant she had cracked the armor of perception, and now they couldn't unsee what she truly was: capable, committed, and utterly unshakable in the face of doubt. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change, not just for Madeline, but for the entire crew of the Highlands construction project. Where there had once been mocking glances and condescending smirks, there was now a cautious respect, tinged with something deeper: curiosity. The tattoo reveal had opened a gate no one had expected, a symbolic doorway that allowed people to reassess their assumptions, and more importantly, themselves. For years, these men had operated within a culture of brute strength, prideful labor, and a narrow definition of toughness, but Madeline's presence, and everything she had come to represent, was starting to rattle that foundation. She hadn't just lifted equipment or rolled gravel. She had lifted the weight of old ways of thinking and scattered it like dust under her boots. Ever since that fateful Friday, Pete, who had once been her loudest critic, became strangely quiet around her. He no longer barked unsolicited instructions or hovered behind her during equipment checks. In fact, he had stopped speaking to her at all, which was a small mercy, but an odd silence nonetheless. Madeline noticed him watching her sometimes from across the yard or through the windshield of a loader, as if he were trying to read a language he'd never learned. She wondered if it was guilt or shame or something else. Fear, maybe. Not of her, but of the crumbling idea that the world made sense only when it was divided cleanly between strong men and delicate women. Maybe, to him, Madeline was a glitch in the system, one he couldn't quite reconcile. Despite the shift in dynamics, not everyone was on board with the change. There were still whispers in the corners, still sideways glances and muttered jokes when they thought she wasn't listening. But they were fewer now, and less venomous, more like the last embers of a fire that didn't have enough oxygen left to burn. Madeline, for her part, remained focused. She was never one to gloat, never one to spike the football. Her satisfaction came not from rubbing her abilities in anyone's face, but from the quiet, simple dignity of doing her job well and doing it honestly. And besides, she didn't have time to dwell on gossip. She had bigger plans. Outside of work, her world was changing too. Word of her tattoo reveal, and what it meant, had spread beyond the job site. A photo had been snapped by one of the younger guys, someone she'd never even spoken to directly, and it ended up on a local social media page titled "Women Who Work." At first, Madeline had been furious. She didn't like being put on display without her permission. But the comments that followed stunned her. Women from nearby counties, old army buddies, single moms, gym rats, even teenagers, had filled the thread with support, admiration, and shared stories of their own struggles with being underestimated. It was overwhelming, humbling, and it changed something in Madeline. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not just as a worker, but as a person. This new visibility came with invitations, too. A regional women's empowerment group asked her to speak at their next gathering. A podcast about unconventional career paths wanted to interview her. Even a small local magazine wanted to feature her in a story titled "Tattooed and Tough: Redefining Strength." Madeline declined the first few offers, uncomfortable with the attention. But after some reflection, and a long, frank conversation with her Aunt Lydia, she realized that maybe her story wasn't just hers anymore. Maybe, by stepping forward, she could help open more doors for others. Maybe she could be the image in someone else's mind when they were told they weren't good enough. Meanwhile, back at the site, a new shipment of heavy materials arrived, a double order by accident. It needed to be unloaded, sorted, and repositioned before the weekend, or else it would block access to the main entrance and delay Monday's concrete pour. As usual, the crew looked around for help, and without hesitation, Madeline stepped forward. No one laughed. No one rolled their eyes. This time, 3 men immediately followed her lead, grabbing gloves and joining her without a word. It wasn't a grand gesture or a slow clap movie moment, but it was real. Quiet progress, honest labor, shared without ego. During lunch that day, something unusual happened. Pete walked over to her table and sat down across from her. He didn't say anything right away, just opened a sandwich, took a bite, and looked across the yard. Madeline waited, not offering anything. Then, after a long pause, he mumbled something that caught her off guard. "I didn't know about your Ranger background," he said. "Didn't even think to ask." It wasn't quite an apology, but it wasn't far from one either. Madeline just nodded, letting the silence do the rest. Sometimes, she knew, progress sounded like awkward honesty instead of polished speeches. That afternoon, something even more significant happened. The company's safety officer, Karen Ortiz, approached Madeline with a proposal. Apparently, the company had been planning to roll out a peer mentorship program for new recruits, especially women entering fieldwork roles. Karen wanted Madeline to help design and possibly even lead it. She said Madeline had a unique lens on the job site dynamic and that her insight could help bridge the gap between training manuals and real-world grit. It was the kind of offer Madeline never expected, and though it scared her a little, leadership wasn't exactly what she'd signed up for. She felt the pull of it. Maybe this was the next evolution of her strength, not just surviving the environment, but shaping it. That night, as she sat on the porch of her cabin with her boots kicked off and her dog Sage snoring beside her, Madeline looked at the stars and thought about how far she had come. She remembered the first day she showed up on site, the backpack heavier than it should have been, the stairs, the doubts, the heat. She remembered what it felt like to keep her head down and just survive the day. But now, the days felt different. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was shifting the air around her, leaving cracks in the walls that once boxed women out. And she knew that tomorrow would bring its own set of challenges, maybe even worse than today's. But she'd be ready, not because of a tattoo, not because of a title, but because she had finally accepted that her story mattered, and because the strongest thing she could do now was keep showing up. Despite the turbulent roar of the backhoes and the clanging echo of metal on metal as the crew adjusted scaffolding around the larger trench, the silence between Nora and Caleb felt heavier than any machinery on site. Caleb's confession had hung in the air like a taut cable, threatening to snap under its own weight. For the first time since their awkward initial encounter, Nora saw him not as a condescending foreman, but as a man grappling with the gnawing truth of his own conscience. There was something raw in his eyes, not unlike the expression of the young recruits she'd trained during the most brutal months of Ranger School, those moments when breaking down was the only path to rebuilding something stronger. She hadn't intended to be anyone's moral compass here. She just wanted to work, to build, to be judged on her merit and her hands, not on her gender, her past, or a faded tattoo on her forearm. But now, her presence had stirred something in Caleb that had long been buried beneath layers of bravado and guilt. He hadn't just dismissed her on the first day, he had seen in her a challenge to everything he thought he knew about strength and leadership, and that scared him. The following morning, a thick fog blanketed the site, and visibility was down to a few yards. Most of the crew had arrived early, coffee in hand, quietly murmuring about the strange calm over the last few days. Something had shifted. They couldn't put a finger on it, but it was as if Nora's quiet determination had infected the rest of them. Even Griff, who had been the loudest in mocking her earlier, now kept his comments to himself. Whether out of respect or fear of the consequences, nobody dared cross the invisible line that seemed to surround her. Yet Nora remained the same, methodical, grounded, and entirely focused on her tasks. She wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't trying to prove anything. That was perhaps what unnerved them the most, her authenticity. Midday came, and with it, a surprise inspection. A representative from the Department of Public Infrastructure arrived unannounced, clipboard in hand, suit jacket dusted with early afternoon grime. Caleb met him near the south edge of the site, where the final stage of the pipeline was being laid. The man nodded toward the trench, where Nora was using a laser level to double-check elevations. He raised an eyebrow and asked, "Who's that?" Caleb, without hesitation and with more pride than he expected, answered, "That's our lead, on the most complicated section of this job. She's the reason we're ahead of schedule." The official gave a curt nod and scribbled something onto his clipboard, the brief exchange unnoticed by most, but it echoed in Caleb's chest like thunder. It was the first time he had claimed Nora as an asset to the team in public, and it felt overdue. Later that week, they hit an unexpected snag, subsurface clay that resisted excavation, threatening to delay the final phase of the project. The equipment began overheating, and the timing sensors in the hydraulic arms malfunctioned. Tension flared among the crew, and Caleb called an emergency meeting. Nora sat quietly as the foreman explained the situation. When the floor opened for suggestions, no one spoke. A few shrugged. One worker half-heartedly mentioned renting newer machinery, but the rental would take 2 days to arrive. Time they didn't have. Then Nora stood up and calmly outlined a rerouting solution using a double-layer trench support technique she'd learned during a military engineering course. At first, Caleb blinked, unsure. Then she offered to demonstrate with a scaled mock-up using scrap rebar and a piece of plywood. Within minutes, the entire team huddled around her makeshift model. Her hands moved quickly and precisely, her voice steady, every detail accounted for. Even Griff leaned in. When she finished, there was silence again, but this time it was reverence. They implemented her plan. Not only did it work, but it also accelerated the work timeline by nearly 6 hours. By evening, the crew gathered around the mobile break room, passing around cans of soda like they had just won a championship. Caleb clinked his can against Nora's and simply said, "You saved us." She didn't deflect or downplay it. She just gave a small nod and sipped quietly, her eyes scanning the fading horizon. That night, as they cleaned up, Caleb approached her again. He told her that the company had submitted her name for a statewide engineering award, one normally reserved for design leads and consultants. Nora looked surprised, then shook her head. "I didn't do this for a plaque," she said. Caleb replied, "I know. That's why you deserve it." Back at her trailer, Nora stared at her old duffel bag. Inside it, tucked beneath her work gloves and tool rolls, was a creased letter from her former commanding officer, reminding her of the promise she'd once made: to carry the discipline of the Rangers into the civilian world, to lead, not with force, but with quiet excellence. She'd spent months wondering if she'd failed in that mission, but now, here in this unlikely corner of Oregon, with a team that had once mocked her and now rallied around her, she felt that maybe she hadn't failed at all. Maybe she had only just begun. The weeks following the awards ceremony were a whirlwind of transformation, not just for Tessa, but for the entire crew and even the surrounding communities who heard about what had happened at the Cascade Ridge site. What began as a grueling construction contract with a divided team ended up becoming a symbol of resilience, discipline, and the power of unseen strength. Local news outlets picked up the story, interviewing Tessa about her background, her ranger training, and her journey from military service to machinery and blue-collar grit. She was hesitant at first, not one for the spotlight, but ultimately agreed when she realized how her story might inspire other women who were questioning their place in traditionally male-dominated industries. She stood not only for herself, but for every woman who had been underestimated, who had been told she couldn't lift, lead, or last. At the sight, the energy had completely shifted. No longer was there an air of quiet disrespect or subtle sabotage. The once dismissive crew now turned to Tessa for insight, guidance, and leadership. She didn't let the new respect inflate her ego. If anything, she doubled down on humility and performance. She helped those who struggled with technical tasks, explained safety protocols with clarity, and took the time to get to know each member of the team on a human level. Some even admitted, sheepishly, that they had misjudged her, not because of her performance, but because they couldn't reconcile her appearance with their idea of strength. The tattoo, though simple, had become a symbol not just of her Ranger past, but of the barrier she shattered. When she finally got around to repainting it to make the lettering bolder, cleaner lines, deeper ink, some of the crew asked if they could watch. It was an odd request, but she understood the sentiment. It wasn't the ink itself they cared about, but the story it now carried. It was more than just a tattoo. It was a scar made visible, a banner of survival, and a lesson etched into skin. Tessa's relationship with Cole evolved too, slowly and with mutual respect. He no longer wore his authority as a shield, but used it as a bridge, asking her opinions on everything from site logistics to crew training and employee morale. She didn't seek credit for changes he implemented, but he gave it freely anyway, even bringing her along to meetings with senior engineers and regional project managers. He described her not only as a rising foreperson, but as someone with the instincts and resilience to handle any job thrown at her. She was surprised when he asked her to co-lead the planning of the next major site project, a high-profile municipal bridge restoration that would require top-tier coordination, a blend of field leadership, and a keen understanding of structural engineering. Tessa didn't say yes right away. She took the time to consider what it meant, not just in terms of the workload, but in how it might position her as a role model. The construction industry still had a long way to go in balancing the scales between gender and grit, and she wasn't interested in tokenism or optics. She agreed only after Cole promised full autonomy and zero fanfare. She didn't need parades. She just needed the chance to do the job right. Outside of work, Tessa started mentoring young women through a local vocational program. Some of them had military backgrounds, others were just curious about entering the trades. They asked the usual questions. Was it hard? Was it scary? Did the men treat her badly? She answered honestly, never sugarcoating the obstacles, but always returning to the theme that strength is often invisible at first. Real strength didn't boast, didn't seek validation, and didn't lash out in the face of skepticism. Real strength showed up, endured the sneers, worked through the weight, and waited until the work itself shouted louder than any insult ever could. As the Cascade Ridge project neared completion, a commemorative plaque was installed at the highest overlook, a scenic viewpoint that had been cleared and stabilized, largely thanks to Tessa's insistence that the rock faces were unstable without proper reinforcement. The plaque didn't bear her name by her request. Instead, it read, "Built by those who carried more than just weight." It was a quiet nod to everyone who had ever borne the invisible burden of being underestimated, dismissed, or doubted. Months later, after the crew had disbanded and gone on to new projects, Tessa received a letter in the mail from one of the former crewmen, a younger guy named Logan, who had once been part of the group mocking her behind her back. He confessed his embarrassment, not just at how he treated her, but at how easily he had allowed others' opinions to shape his own. He wrote that after watching her lead, he'd enrolled in night school to become a site supervisor, inspired by how she had combined toughness with knowledge and compassion. Tessa folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small metal box she kept in her tool chest, the same one she'd carried since her first day on a job site, scarred and scratched from years of use. That box held her Ranger pins, a few old photos, and now a handwritten reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are not the loudest. They're the quiet changes you spark in others, simply by showing up, refusing to bend, and doing the hard thing anyway. In the end, Tessa's story was not just about a woman proving herself in a world of steel and noise. It was about how battles fought with quiet persistence, how scars turned into symbols, and how strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just keeps working long after the laughter fades. And now, across construction camps and small towns alike, they remember her not by her struggle, but by the tattoo that silenced mockery with legacy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.